Dr. Gregory Beabout got his PhD from Marquette in 1988. He's a professor of philosophy at St. Louis University. He teaches and does research in ethics, Kierkegaard, personalism, and Catholic social thought. Informed by his engagement with the history of philosophy, some of his work involves applying personalism and the tradition of the virtues to business and the professions. In this talk titled, "Whose Capitalism? Which Freedom?" Dr. Beabout explains how central aspects of a market system accord with human nature.
I'm going to begin by telling a couple of stories, and then I want to get to sort of the meat of what I have to say, talk through some examples, some contemporary situations, maybe conclude with some conceptual clarification. As Dr. Duchamp said, I'm a philosopher, so I get to engage in the activities and disciplines and practices of philosopher, which includes telling stories and setting forth arguments and clarifying concepts. Those are the main things I'm going to do. The first story that I'm going to tell is an ancient story. It's a story that Plato told in the Republic at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic. I hope you've heard the story before, but if you haven't, or if it's been a while since you've heard the story, let's recount it together. As Plato tells the story in the Republic, he has Socrates serve as the narrator. So it's Socrates narrating this story. The story is set in a cave, in a dark cave. The central characters in the story are prisoners. They were chained up and they're staring at a wall, and all they see are movements and figures, these images moving. They hear voices, and then in the story, one of the characters is unchained, turns, right, and sees behind him a sort of track, a sort of parapet. There's this marionettes or puppets or something, and behind it a fire. And all of a sudden he has this moment of insight. You know, in the story there's these series of insights, and so the character has this moment of insight. Oh, everything that I've been looking at those are shadows, right? And it's these puppets. We should have been paying attention to them, not to the shadows. And it's that fire. And he's drawn to this. He starts moving towards the fire, and then beyond it, he sees towards the mouth of the cave another kind of light, different from the light of the fire. And he's drawn towards this and is making his way up this rocky, craggy cave, dragged up in places to move out. And then you get this moment where he moves out of the cave. If you've had this experience, you know what it's like to be in sort of darkness, and then it's like just painful to your eyes. He's looking down, he can't even hold his eyes open, and sees on the ground shapes and movements and shadows, maybe from trees and birds and squirrels and animals and so forth. And as his eyes begin to adjust, looks up and sees the trees, the birds and the other animals and so forth, and then sees beyond them the sun. So again, has this moment of insight that, sees this sun as the source of all reality, right? This highest idea. Right before this, at the end of Book 6, it sort of set forth this account of the world, of reality and of truth, where there's the world is divided into the visible realm and the intelligible realm, and within the visible realm, the world is divided into, actual visible things, and then things that are shadows or reflections or images of those things. But even these things, like this podium or this table, it's proposed, is itself an image or a reflection of some other reality, an intelligible reality. So the shape of this table, this rectangular shape, is itself a participation in something intelligible that transcends the world of particularity. So the story, which has been very influential in Western culture and Western civilization, it seems to me, sets forth this, it's frequently taken to be a story that sets forth the Platonic philosophy, that what's real and true and good is universal. It transcends particularity, right? And so I tell this story in part to help us meditate on a kind of metaphysics of the local. And the way this story is frequently understood, it seems to me, the local is lesser. That to be concerned with what's really important is to be concerned with something that transcends the local, that which is universal, utterly intelligible, eternal, unchanging. Think of how influential this story has been in Western culture. Think of Shakespeare. What's the sonnet? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark. Right, that notion that love, true love, is not this sort of particularity of this emotion that I feel now, the capturing of the way her gentle beauty captures my eye. Love is something more than that. It transcends that. It's an ever fixed mark. Or think of C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. When I was a young teenager, like probably many of you, I read those books, and you get this story of entering through the wardrobe, entering into Narnia, discovering that there's another world beyond this world. And then as you read those stories, you see even that is not the highest reality. There's some ultimate reality. Or maybe some of you are not readers of C.S. Lewis, but watchers of The Matrix, where you get a similar philosophy, right? That beyond, right, this world, we're really stuck in a matrix, right? And there's this other realm, this higher reality. All these, it seems to me, are suggestions that what's real is something beyond the local, right? But let's go back and look at the story, because this is not the only way to interpret the story of the allegory of the cave. I cut off the story right in the middle of it. Right? The way the story goes, once the person is out there and gazes upon the sun, senses this urge to want to return back into the cave, to tell the others, the other cave dwellers, about this reality out there. And so he goes back into the cave, right? Works his way down, his eyes having difficulty adjusting, encountering the others, and you remember how it turns out, not so well, right? Tells them, hey, you shouldn't be staring at those things on the wall. Those are just shadows. There's this whole other thing out there. There's these puppets, right? And those puppets are themselves just images of these other animals outside of the cave. There's a whole other world, and the cave dwellers want nothing to do with this. In fact, as the story goes, right, they bring charges against this person. They bring him to court, right? He's sentenced to death and killed, right? There's, of course, an irony in Plato's telling of the story. It's Socrates who's narrating the tale. And Socrates, of course, at the writing of it, has already had charges brought against him and has already been sentenced to death and executed. And maybe what Plato is saying to us is something like this, right? If we're going to engage in the practice and discipline of philosophy, we need to do so artfully. We need to encounter our contemporaries in such a way that as we awaken them and build up in them the dispositions and habits of character and mind that are needed to take up this journey, right? It needs to be done maybe not quite the way Socrates did it, as a gadfly needling contemporaries, where their response is, right, prosecution. Bring him to court, execute him, right? Maybe there's a sort of subtle criticism of his mentor and friend that Plato is suggesting that we can handle this in a way better than the way Socrates himself handled it. Inspired as he was by Socrates' example, it seems to me, perhaps suggesting that we can be philosophers that do what Socrates does without ourselves ending up drinking hemlock. If that's right, then we need to be attentive to the particularities of our concrete circumstance. And if that's right, then all of a sudden we notice that all of Plato's writings are writings that are saturated with particularity, with the local, with the here and now. We don't get in his writings, right, a grand theory of another realm. We get in his writings dialogues of this person, Socrates, encountering this person, Thrasymachus or Glaucon or Eidymachus or whoever it is, right? In this place, at this time, in this local situation, so that maybe even in Plato's philosophy, right, we have a philosophy of the local. Now, even if you're not convinced by that, you should be convinced by this, that Plato's greatest student, Aristotle, right, utterly gives us this, that for Aristotle, right, reality discloses itself to us through the concrete particularity of individual substances, right, that we encounter a world of this tree, right, this grass, this day, these particular individual human beings, and so forth. So it's, yeah, I just wanted to begin the conversation by pointing to, right, some very deep metaphysical questions about the local and the way that I think there's a tendency in us, because of the abstractive powers of the human intellect, our ability to abstract intelligibility out of the here and now, to then want to focus on that intelligibility as abstracted, detached, disengaged, universal, and to become neglectful of the particularity of the local, the particular, of which we are inextricably embodied. And right, so there's point number one, story number one is to recognize that this debate that we're having is an ancient debate, and that we're participants in a very long and deep conversation about, among other things, the metaphysics of the local. Second story. This is a more recent story. When I was about your age, I did the junior year abroad thing, right, in Italy. I was a student in Italy, so come with me on a journey in Italy. I had a Eurail pass. We're traveling on the train. If you've never done this, you've at least, I hope, seen pictures in films or movies. So imagine this European train. You go in the compartment. There's seating for 6, 3 on this side, 3 on this side, and we're sitting on our side and across the way, right? Some others, this young woman from Italy is across the way, and I began having this conversation with her. Now, before I went, I had studied Italian, 6 hours, college level Italian. Here's the trick if you're going to learn another language. Trick number one, get the flashcards, right? Learn basic grammar. If you learn 1,000 words, maybe 1,500 words in a language, right, you can get pretty far with 1,000 or 1,500 words. Basic grammar. Now, next trick, always speak in the present tense. That helps. And you can carry on like a 5-year-old, right? Add to that, in Italy, there you got these two advantages. When I was there, right, this is 33 years ago, so almost nobody there spoke English. Right? At that time, now you go, you get, even the menus have English translation, right? It says spaghetti underneath, spaghetti. Thank you. Zucchini. Zucchini. So it's not that hard. And we're having this conversation, we're talking, but after a while, I think she figured out that there's only so many things you can say with 1,000 or 1,500 words. You can twist them around in a lot of different ways and seem interesting for a while, but after a while, I got the picture. She didn't think I was that interesting. And so she said to me, in Italian, we're speaking in Italian, and she says, when I was in high school, I had to study English. 3 years, I studied English. I've never had the opportunity to speak English with anyone. Would you mind if we switch and begin speaking English? Sì, va bene, right? So this is the moment of the switch, right? She begins the conversation in English. This is the first thing she says to me. She looks at me and she says, "Are you strange?" I'm thinking, I really miscalculated this situation. How do you respond to that, right? And then all of a sudden, I realize, wait, in Italian, straniero it's like our word stranger, right? A foreigner, right? So what she has said to me, are you a foreigner? Are you a visitor to our country from another land, right? You see what's happened? I hear, are you strange? I'm thinking, are you weird? Are you a little bit off? Right? She says, right? Are you strange? She means, are you a foreigner? Right? Have you come to us? Sí, Americano, right? And boom, right? I am an American, right? I come to you from Chicago. Look at what's happened. Now, there's been a breakdown, but it's not the kind of breakdown that we had in the old story of the Tower of Babel. Remember the story there? All the people of the earth are building this tower. They think they can build a tower up to the heavens, and the good Lord looks down as these people have gotten a little bit proud for themselves. Let's shake things up. We'll make it so they all speak different languages. And after that, you get some that speak, right, Hebrew or Greek or whatever. They're all speaking different languages. And now we get the communication problems, right, that one person says one thing and one person says something else. We say cat, they say gato, right? But that's not really the situation that we've got now in the train or the situation that we have in the contemporary world, I want to propose. I'll call the problem that we have the problem of the new Babel. The old Babel, the problem was we're speaking different languages, so we can't understand one another. In the new Babel, everybody speaks the same language, or there's at least just a handful of modern, cosmopolitan, maybe sort of rootless languages, right? That everyone speaks these, mostly, right? English or maybe French or Spanish or something. One time I was at meetings in Poland. This was soon after the collapse of communism in Poland. I was at these, the theme of the meetings was freedom and culture. I want to say this because part of my presentation this morning is on freedom. It was like this meeting in only this little way. At the meetings, they had television cameras. Usually when philosophers speak, there are no TV cameras involved, right? But in Poland, right after the fall of communism, people were so excited about the opportunity to speak openly about freedom and culture. They'd brought in scholars from all over the world to have this conversation about what it means to be a free society, what it means to have a free culture. So after one of the evenings, one of the sessions in the evening, we gather, there's 8 of us at this, and we had sat down at the table together. Some of us had gotten our drinks, and we're waiting for this moment when someone's going to say the first thing, right? And so it's my colleague from Belgium who speaks first, and here's what he says. Thankfully to me, he's speaking in English. The official languages of the conference were Polish, right? French, German, and English, right? And so he speaks in English, and he says, "Do you know what is the most widely spoken language in the world?" I say, Chinese? I don't know. He says, bad English. So it gives permission to everyone at the table, my colleague from Uganda, from Japan, from India, from Brazil. We're all gathered together. Now we can speak bad English together. But one of the features of this sort of bad English, this, I do a lot of work with aviation executives, right? And in the world of aviation, English is the language of aviation, right? Because you've got flights coming in and out of all places all over the world, and they need to learn English. But you can have pretty bad English. I mean, it's, is the runway open? What if, you know, you get, you learn your 1,500 words and you're good to go there. But there's sort of deep philosophical terms that end up getting used in really different ways as a part of our culture. Right? That's what I want to call into focus, call to attention to you. In doing so, I'm in some ways following the work of Alistair McIntyre in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? Right? And so he shows in that book that one of the sort of pervasive features of contemporary culture is that we're infected by, he doesn't call it the problem of the new Babel, but it seems to me that's the problem, one of the central moral problems of our time, right? Who's for justice? Everyone, right? The problem is what this person describes as justice, right? Others see as injustice. And what this person sees as justice, right? This person sees as injustice, right? So we're using the same words to mean really different things. We're frequently not aware of it. Further, and McIntyre makes this point, we're not aware that we're speaking a language that has a grammar, right? That has a history, that has a tradition. So one of the things I appreciated very much about Professor Rubio's talk is how much she wanted to see herself as situated in a particular tradition, where she's using a clear grammar, using words in a way that have been developed and articulated through a tradition, right? But also a recognition that putting that language out there in the public means encountering people who use some of the same words at times in slightly different ways. So that's what I'd like to do this morning, is meditate for a while on the terms and the title of my talk, Whose Capitalism, Which Freedom? You'll have to forgive me now, I'm the son of a school teacher, My mother's a great first grade teacher, and I'm not sure I've ever surpassed her in her excellence in teaching. So I will act now as a school teacher and give a handout. The handout contains two separate things. One is a passage from the 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus. I'll say a few words about Centesimus Annus, and then I want to turn to this passage. The title, Centesimus Annus, is this part of the reading that some of you have done? And help me here to familiarize me. So how much do I need to say? You guys read parts, all? So maybe I don't need to say much. I'll just say a little bit. Of course, you know, it's the Latin title is On the 100th Anniversary. It's the 100th anniversary of Pope Leo's encyclical Rerum Navarre. The encyclical is divided into 6 parts, right? The first part, let's look back and reread Rerum Navarre. All right, second part, let's look around and see how does Rerum Navarre apply to our day, 1991. Now, I remember clearly when the encyclical came out. Some of you, I suppose, this was, I don't know, maybe you're born in around this time, is that right? So you don't remember it. Part 3, chapter 3, maybe to me the most interesting chapter of any of the social encyclicals that I know. The title of the chapter, The Year 1989. What a crazy name for a chapter. An encyclical, the Pope is going to think, what happened in 1989? It's very interesting because, two things. Think of the great years of revolution in Europe. 1789, the French Revolution. 1815 was a year of revolution. 1830, 1848, 1870, 1917, 1956, right? You've got this whole series of revolutionary uprisings. And then 1989. Looks like a really different kind of revolution. I remember it so clearly where I was. I was getting my oil changed. I'm sitting in the waiting room. I'm looking at the little TV, and there they show the Berlin Wall. I had just been there a few years before. I see it getting knocked down. The students up there just tearing it down. And so he's meditating on this question. What happened? What just happened? It's also interesting because, right, the encyclical is promulgated by Pope John Paul II, who played, I think, no small role in what just happened. Part of what happened is he continued to visit those countries and to continue to say, the way you have organized yourselves, right, is in profound and fundamental violation of what it means to be a human person. This way of organizing yourselves just cannot be sustained, right? And 1989, boom, it goes down. By 1991, the whole Soviet experiment had imploded and crumbled. I mean, just think, 10 years before, it seemed really unimaginable that it would happen. And so the following chapters, there's 3 more chapters in the book, in the encyclical. Chapter 4 is titled The Universal Destination of Material Goods, right? It's on private property. The ancient teaching of the church is the Lord has given the material goods of the earth, right, to human beings for their well-being. It's part of the ancient Genesis account, right? The good Lord creates the world, right? Creates human beings, right? To human beings, they're charged with being stewards of the earth, but not to any particular human being. It's not as if you get this and you get this. That's left to us, right? To use our intelligence and our initiative to determine how we're going to divide up the material goods of the earth. the church has long been an advocate of the system of private property, right? Not in the sense that people are lords of the earth, that they get to do whatever they want, but in the sense that people are stewards of their lives, right? Of their labor and of the fruits of their labor. Chapter 5 then is on state and culture. I'll say a few words about that. And then chapter 6 is on the human person. So within the chapter on the universal destination of material goods on private property, he takes up this section 42. Let's read it together. He writes, returning now to the initial question, can it perhaps be said that after the failure of communism, capitalism is the victorious social system, and that capitalism should be the goal of the countries now making efforts to rebuild their economy and society? Is this the model which ought to be proposed to the countries of the third world, which are searching for the path to true economic and civil progress? The answer is obviously complex. If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, even though it would perhaps be more appropriate to speak of a business economy or market economy or simply a free economy. But if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative. The Marxist solution has failed, but the realities of marginalization and exploitation remain in the world, especially the third world, as does the reality of human alienation, especially in the more advanced countries. Against these phenomena, the church strongly raises her voice. Vast multitudes are still living in conditions of great material and moral poverty. The collapse of the communist system in so many countries certainly removes an obstacle to facing these problems in an appropriate and realistic way. But it is not enough to bring about their solution. Indeed, there's a risk that a radical capitalistic ideology could spread, which refuses even to consider these problems, in the a priori belief that any attempt to solve them is doomed to failure, and which blindly entrusts their solution to the free development of market forces. Let's spend a little time trying to unpack this section. I want to work backwards and start with the third paragraph. Okay? The third paragraph, he begins by noting that the Marxist solution has failed, but the realities, right, that sort of were the fuel of Marxism, marginalization, exploitation, alienation, right? Those in many ways remain, right? So the church, right, even going back to the beginning of Marxism, think of the year 1848, when Marx and Engels issued the manifesto, right? You get writings at that time by Catholic writers taking it on directly, right? I'm thinking of Wilhelm von Kettler, right? In Advent of that year, the bishop asked him to issue a series of homilies, of talks on the social question of the day. He takes on these very questions: marginalization, exploitation, alienation. But he proposes that the Marxist solution is not only is it not going to help, it'll make things worse, right? And he attempts to propose a different kind of framework. Pope Leo in Rerum Navarre, right, explicitly develops and builds on the teachings of Kettler. In fact, Leo called Kettler my great teacher, right? And so we've got this long tradition there of recognizing there are ways in which industrial capitalism, right, have introduced new kinds of social questions and new social problems, right? And that Marxism, proposes a solution to these, but a solution that in some ways is going to make things worse rather than better. Pushing back to the previous paragraph then, we get this distinction between two different kinds of capitalism, right? Should we be for capitalism or against capitalism, right? Answer? Well, what do you mean by capitalism, right? We have to, right? Are you strange? Right? All right. Before we answer the question, we better figure out what exactly is going on and how is this word being used, right? So, if by capitalism, right, let's work backwards, right? The second half of the paragraph. If it is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector, right, is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, right? Right. So if there's an understanding of capitalism where capitalism means, right, rapacious markets where those who are in power do what they want, right? Then the Pope suggests, no, we shouldn't endorse that. William McGurn of the Wall Street Journal, he used to draw a distinction between being pro-market and pro-business, right? And it's worth noting that very frequently, those who are pro-business pass themselves off as pro-market, right? What they're really interested in is, right, creating monopolistic conditions for the flourishing of their own business, right? Using the resources of government to make it so that they don't have much competition and that they can gain advantage for themselves, which turns out to be not really pro-market at all, right? Seems to me the framework that's suggested here in this paragraph, and which is developed very explicitly in the following chapter, is a tripartite framework. There's three parts. It means this: if we're going to be, right, for markets, free markets, we have to recognize that freedom in the market sector is part of freedom in a larger social sector, that it has to be circumscribed by a political juridical sphere, a governmental sector, right, that includes, right, not only legislative and executive branches, right, but a juridical branch, a place where there are disputes, the disputing parties can take their disputes to resolve their disputes, where there's the rule of law, where there's the ability for members of the society to participate in choosing who their leaders are going to be, how the laws of their society are going to be shaped, and so forth. But even more important than the market sector being framed on the one hand, right, by a political sector, a free polity, is this other sector that Dr. Rubio emphasized, the moral cultural sphere, right? That includes all the things that she was discussing: families, right? Neighborhoods, churches and church groups, athletic groups, literary groups, musical groups, dramatic associations, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and fish fries and all of the things that make our lives more humane and more divine, the different sort of rich intermediary associations of which we are most of us members of more of those than we can think of. But in the Soviet system, these had been obliterated to a great extent, and even in the advanced economies of global capitalism, they're frequently obliterated in various subtle ways. It's worth noticing how much our participation in some features of global capitalism end up undermining our opportunities for participating in those kinds of local and more humane kinds of intermediary associations. One year when I was at meetings with an international group of which I'm a member, my colleague from Moscow was with us, and after one of the sessions, there was in the city where we were meeting an international folk festival going on, and they had folk groups from all over the world that were there. It was curious. The representatives from the United States, there was one American group there, and they were from Georgia, and it was a marching band. There were all African Americans, and with this really bombastic style. You've probably seen these kinds of marching bands, really energetic, and it was just like, just as they came by, you're like, whoa, right? You felt like an American, right there. And then later, there was this group from Russia, and they were, the Cossack Dancers, and they were, and he was very concerned about them. He said that after the collapse of communism, you'd seen this rise of these 19th century Cossack groups, and he thought that there was a kind of ideology associated with that he thought was very dangerous and unhelpful. And so my question to him was, how did they get here? And he said, what do you mean, how did they get here? And I said, well, who paid for them to come? And he still didn't get the question. And I said to him, look, I'll bet you that marching band that we saw, probably, here's how they got here. Car washes, pizza sales. Some of you have been participants in these kinds of groups that have taken trips, some overseas. My son, when he was in high school, their marching band, they marched in Michigan and then in Toronto, and the big trip for them was for a lot of the kids, first time they'd ever left the United States of America. And 2 years of planning with parents groups doing, a lot of car washes, and a lot of selling chocolate bars and all the things that it takes to be a member of a group like that, to help and think of how deeply that's a part of our cultural experience. After the collapse of communism in 1991, Robert Putnam wrote a little piece titled Bowling Alone, right? In the essay, he says, the debate that's going on about Eastern Europe and the former Soviet countries tends to be a debate about, it's a binary debate. Markets or government, right? What do we need? How can we introduce Western-style capitalism into these countries? How can we introduce democratic governments into these groups? And he's saying, look, what's missing is another very strong feature of our culture that we don't notice. That is, what helps us participate in both the market sphere and the governmental sphere is habits of trust that are developed through these other kinds of associations. Parent booster groups and marching band groups and other folk group and blah, 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 all these kinds of things. And so he points to bowling right? The piece came out in the early 90s. He shows that over the last, I don't remember in his studies, 20 years, the number of bowlers in the United States has remained relatively flat, right? However, the number of Americans who bowl in leagues has plummeted, okay? Right, so he tracks the sociology of bowling leagues, right? And people who are bowling in leagues, right? And then the way that has gone down. And then he tells a number of stories, right? He later published a book, and he begins the book, Bowling Alone, with this story that in the members of one of these bowling leagues find out one of the other members of the bowling league had severe health problems. I can't remember, maybe I get these wrong. Kidney transplant, can you get a kidney? I think that's right. One of the other members of the bowling league goes in and offers him, right, a kidney, right? Didn't know the guy, except they were in the bowling league together, right? And so in Putnam's book, he tracks all kinds of things. Bridge clubs, right, card-playing groups, and all the sort of rich kinds of social associations that have tended to characterize the American experience in ordered liberty. Here's a difficulty, though, is that our participation in these kinds of local associations, right, has tended to be on the decline, right? Now, it's hard to tell how much of that is just a feature of people don't join the Elks Club or the Moose or the VFW or the Knights of Columbus in ways that they did in earlier generations. Maybe it's being replaced by other kinds of social groups, Facebook groups, or these kinds of things. But it's right. It's worth spending some time thinking through that and thinking about the way you spend your free time as social time and the kind of face-to-face social encounters that you participate in through those, the kinds of habits and dispositions that are cultivated through your social encounters, and how that makes you connected, more connected to other people who are in your community. I want to point to 2 or 3 other examples of forms of capitalism that might better fit this description at the beginning of that paragraph where he says the answer is obviously complex. If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, right, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, right? Should we all be capitalists now, right? What is the Pope saying? Yes, right? If we mean this, right? But that gives rise to very serious governance questions, right? Why do people form capitalist associations? Typically, it's to finance large projects that cannot be financed by a smaller group, right? So then you, right, form a larger group, right? Sell stock, right? The typical way of structuring it then is the stockholders, right, represented to have a board. You have upper management and a CEO that's accountable to the board, right? And a management structure in the company with the workers that are accountable to their managers, who are accountable to their upper managers, who are accountable to the CEO, who are accountable to the board, who's accountable to the shareholders. It's a very common, widely held organizational structural model within capitalism. But it's not the only model, and maybe it's worth saying a few things about some other models. Dr. Rubio mentioned briefly microfinancing, right? Microfinancing, as you may be familiar, works in a different sort of a way. There you've got typically relatively smaller groups, right, offering small loans, sometimes very small, $50, $100 loans especially to people in developing countries, where it started with Muhammad Yunus in India and Bangladesh and that part of the world, but it's spread throughout much of the world. So there you get people, a group, typically maybe 8 people, 8 women. Their collateral is the group, right? And so they agree that if we're going to get a loan of whatever it's going to be, $100 to buy some goats and a thermometer, right? With the thermometer, you can then pasteurize the milk, right? Measure it and make sure the milk is healthy, right? And then you can, right? Start your business and run your business and charge more for your milk because it's right? Pasteurized properly. Run a profitable business, right? And repay the loan, right? So it seems to me that's a model that's worth exploring more deeply to develop some of the things that Dr. Rubio was saying. Opportunities for looking at how one's own giftedness can interact with the giftedness of others, where there can be a genuine market exchange, where it's a participation in a capitalist system, but it's doing so in a way that involves some of these other features here of free human creativity and responsibility and so forth. I want to point to 2 other examples like that before I work towards my conclusion. I want to say a few words about the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region of northern Spain. In the 1930s, Franco, I think it's not incorrect to use the term dictator, right, took over in that, if you can think of Picasso's famous painting Guernica, right, where there's a great deal of destruction in that part of the world. Afterwards, I mean, you see pictures of that time, and they were just devastated in the Basque region of northern Spain. Franco wanted to completely take over. A priest in that area, he looked at the situation afterwards and he thought, all right, what can be done here? He started a youth group, then he started a high school. The high school emphasized science and mathematics to prepare students for university education. A group of his students went on, became engineers, right? And then they got jobs. After 5 years or so working in the corporate world, they were disenchanted. They came back to him and they said they want to start their own company, right? The name of the town is Mondragon, M-O-N, and then like our word dragon, right? Mondragon or something. And so they started a company where they were making paraffin wax heaters. It was their own design, very simple sort of thing. They had maybe 100 laborers. The way they set up the company, though, the workers, right, could, over a period of years, buy in and own stock in the company, okay? So the workers became the owners of the company. Right? Within a few years, it was a flourishing company. Almost everyone in that part of Spain was using these little heaters, right? And then they realized, oh, we can make this next thing, right? And this next thing. But they made a couple of interesting decisions next. The next thing they realized was they needed capitalization to expand. So the next thing they developed was a credit union, right? The credit union used the same model. It was, right, those who transferred their funds into the credit union became the owners of the credit union. It's worth reflecting upon your own banking decisions, right? I use 2 banks. My mortgage is through US Bank, right? But most of my banking services, I use a credit union, okay? The credit union is the owners of the credit union are the members. It's a member-owned credit union, right? Everyone in the credit union ends up knowing everybody else. Well, I don't know everyone else in the credit union, but I know this. When I walk in, they know me, right? And I know the management structure there. It's not a very complicated management structure. I know who's in charge, right? I know who Mary is accountable to, right? The board. The board is made up of members, right? And so it's a structure where, right, you've got a management system, but since the managers are accountable to, right, the members, right, it's a very different model than a typical shareholder model where the CEO is accountable to the board, and the board sees itself as accountable to people outside of the organization, the shareholders that are outside of the organization. They use this model for their credit union. The credit union then begins capitalizing other companies. So they come up with a business plan for another household utility device that they can build. They do so, becomes a profitable company, and so forth. Another one, another one, another one. In the Basque region of northern Spain today, so this began developing in the 40s and the 50s, expanded significantly through the 60s and 70s, and continues to grow. The Basque region of northern Spain, the Mondragon cooperatives now are the largest employer. They use a model where each company caps itself at about 250. If they see they're going to grow beyond that, they divide themselves up and form another company. They've also developed companies in other parts of the world. In the United States of America, there's one such group. It's in Little Rock, Arkansas. They make bicycles, advanced for triathletes, right? So they're very sophisticated bicycles, although they have a whole line of bicycles and other materials that triathletes would use, their special sporting gear and so forth. But it's a model of worker-owned cooperatives where you've got a management structure. The managers report to the owners. The owners are the workers. If you're going to step away and no longer work there, then you have to sell your share in the company. The companies have benefits, insurance, a retirement plan, all this sorts of things. I strongly encourage you to investigate this as a sort of alternative model of participating in a market economy. I want to conclude with just some brief reflections on the meaning of freedom. When the Pope says that he endorses a capitalism understood this way, and a business economy, a market economy, a free economy, what is freedom? I take it if we ask most Americans, what is freedom? The answer comes pretty readily. Freedom means doing whatever you want. Okay? Philosophers understand this or define this as negative freedom, right? Where it's freedom from external restraint. Okay? But if we consider more deeply when the Pope says, for example, right, at the service of human freedom in its totality. What is human freedom in its totality? It can't just be freedom from restraint, right? Very easy to see this, right? If you think it's just, most teenagers figure this out, or you can watch the Bill Murray film, right? Groundhog Day of Freedom means I do whatever I want, right? All right, here's what I want. I want to eat 20 donuts, right? And then what happens is I don't feel so good, right? Or, right, I want to, it's not that unusual for young people to try experiments with alcohol. I want to do this, and then all of a sudden you find out that's not so good. Some of these experiments don't work out well at all, right? Where you see you become a slave to something rather than, right, becoming more free, right? See, at the heart of freedom, think of the word. Etymologically, it reveals something to us. It's the same etymology as our word friend. right? Or our word Friday. See, from Old German, Old Norse, Friday is the day of the goddess free, right? Who's she? She's the wife of Odin. Wednesday is named for, right? Woden, Odin. Fry is devoted to Woden. Why? Out of love. She loves him. Woden kept slaves. Why did the slaves stay? Right? Because you didn't want to mess with Woden, right? Why does Fry stay? Right? Out of love, right? So in Danish, the word free, F-R-I, pronounced free, means a proposal of marriage, to become engaged, right? So freedom includes within it this sense of self-determined action, this giving of oneself, of being a friend to another, of giving yourself to another in love. And so this other aspect of freedom is what philosophers call positive freedom, this freedom to determine one's action or one's agency. But if freedom includes the ability to act, then right away, that gives rise to the question, what should I do? Right? If I have the freedom to direct myself, what are the goods towards which I should direct myself? And so there's this other aspect of freedom, this moral freedom, this freedom for excellence, right? Freedom to choose what is good and just and honest and true. And so, returning to my title, Whose Capitalism, Which Freedom? If by capitalism, right, we mean this ability to participate in a free market system, right, where we can exercise responsibility, creativity, initiative, and so forth, then, as the Pope says, that's the sort of freedom that we want in a market system. With that, I'll bring my remarks to a close. Thank you very much.